From Munich, I made my way to Stuttgart and the 5th General Hospital. It had been over 20 years since my Canadian friend Pat and I had arrived with our backpacks to experience a whole new way of life. Certainly one that was very different from our roles as au pairs in Switzerland, although we were still caretakers of a kind. As I left my cosy B&B to take the tram to the US Army Hospital in Bad Cannstatt, I thought of Miss Walter, who'd been my guardian angel in Stuttgart and beyond. Pat and I had met this elderly lady on a tram when we'd arrived in the German city, and she'd been so kind to us, finding lodging and reluctantly taking us to the 5th General, which she told us was a terrible place. There were men with guns. If only she'd known what went on within the walls of this American Army hospital, she would have surely fainted on the spot. However, whenever I visited her in the small apartment she shared with her slightly younger sister, I kept the sordid details to myself. I chose only to share the good stuff, and there was definitely lots of that. I'd stayed in touch with Miss Walter for many years afterwards, until her death, and she'd continued to be very comforting to me during sad times in my life, especially after my brother John passed away at the age of 17. Whenever I was at a crossroads and times of indecision, even though I hadn't always shared these moments with Miss Walter, I'd suddenly receive a letter from her with an appropriate uplifting Bible verse. She always seemed to know what I needed. It was almost as if she was inside my head. This lovely lady was one of those friends who was in my life for a reason, a season, and a lifetime, albeit short on her part. As I now approached the entrance gates to the hospital, I certainly felt her presence. But there was something wrong with the picture in front of me. Even though the buildings, which had a somewhat medieval quality, were still exactly as I remembered them, the whole place was practically deserted, and there was no soldier on the gate wielding an evil gun. Where was everyone? The sole purpose for my visit to the 5th General Hospital, apart from a walk down memory lane, of course, was to take photos of the various locations so that they could be recreated, since I was sure it wouldn't be possible to film in the actual hospital. I walked over to the entrance and took the isolated stairs to the pathology lab on the 2nd floor with, frankly, some trepidation. It was a very eerie feeling as I walked along the empty corridor of the lab towards the office where I'd spent 6 months of my life as the drug abuse secretary / unofficial therapist. "Hello," I called out. "Is anyone here?" The constant music, relentless chatter, GIs yelling, "I'm short!" The noise of the spinning centrifuge machine, the hustle and bustle, the craziness, had all disappeared. I imagined the poor GI drug addict slouching against the corridor wall, waiting to offer their urine to be tested, the quirky Sergeant Friedlander, and the bullish Captain Cartwright. But they were nowhere to be seen. It seemed that the lab was no longer a functioning part of the hospital. But since there didn't appear to be activity anywhere else either, I wondered what on earth I'd stepped into. It was a complete mystery. I was just about to call out again when a familiar figure walked towards me from the other end of the corridor. "Who is it?" he said sternly. "Mehmet?" I was astonished to see one of the Turkish civilian lab techs I'd worked with all those years ago. Although his hair was grey, he'd actually aged quite well. Obviously, I hadn't, because when I said, "It's Marie, remember I worked here in 1972, he responded, "You got old." Well, thanks a lot. He'd always been quite surly, and he hadn't changed a bit, except there was always a little twinkle in his eye, and I think he was secretly pleased to see me. "What's going on, Mumette? Where is everyone?" He explained that the hospital was being handed back to the German government the following week, that all the Americans had left, and only civilians were there now, cleaning up. I had absolutely no idea that the 5th General US Army Hospital was closing down, and I couldn't believe I'd arranged to visit just 1 week before it was being handed back to the German government. I'd got there just in time. A sure sign that serendipity was at work again. Or perhaps on this occasion, Miss Walter had something to do with it. I told Mumette about my script and that I wanted to take photos of the various locations mentioned in the story. He didn't think it was a problem, so I took as many photos as I could of the lab. Naturally, Mumette wanted his photo taken too. Then I visited other areas of the hospital featured in the script, including the BOQ, the Bachelor Officers' Quarters where I lived. It was so strange seeing all the abandoned rooms and the lifeless kitchen where we made our weekly hash-spiked brownies. I stood in my room, 44B, where so many parties had been held, and I relived those crazy and wonderful times. And I smiled as I snapped away with my camera. I took photos at the exterior of the BOQ and the hospital buildings as well as the chapel. Then it was time to venture across to the mess hall where I'd first met Dave and where his best friend Billy Sutton had been murdered. You may recall that Dave was falsely accused of that murder. Back in the day, whenever it was bad weather, we used to walk from the hospital to the mess hall by way of tunnels. And I remember how creepy it was, with hissing pipes and what seemed like sighs and whispers emanating from the walls. Then there were the echoes of footsteps that didn't always seem to belong to the GIs and civilians heading for lunch. These, the guys joked, were German ghosts that were roaming the tunnels from the Second World War. Because the mess hall was an integral part of my story, it was necessary for me to take that walk again, but this time on my own. I moved at quite a speedy pace, and I took only photos that I thought were absolutely essential. You know, the tunnels weren't quite as ominous as I remembered, but I was nonetheless happy when I finally arrived at the mess hall, which was a shell of its former self. All of these locations were nothing without the people I'd known and the life I'd experienced at the 5th General Hospital. I'd grown to love, understand, and respect these crazy Yanks. It was these great and complicated people who opened a door for me into a new way of life in America. With this period of my life behind me, I took a train to Rome, where I was going to visit my friend Gail, who I'd met several years before when we were both working for Steven Spielberg's company, Amblin. She'd been director Bob Zemeckis' personal assistant on Back to the Future, and then moved on to a job at 20th Century Fox. She didn't really care for it much. "Well, what do you fancy doing?" I asked her. I don't know." Then she took a breath. "I'd really like to travel, go to Paris and Rome." "That sounds great," I enthused. "When are you going to do that?" "Oh, one of these days." "And exactly which day is that going to be, Gail?" She gave me a look, and then her face lit up. "I'm going to do it soon." Then she really got excited. "Yes, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to Paris and Rome, London first, of course." I told her that I had a good friend in London, Margaret, who I was sure she could stay with en route to Paris. That was enough to encourage Gail, and she began making travel plans. Within a few months, she'd bought one-way tickets to London, Paris and Rome, where she'd been living for almost a year, working as an English teacher and nanny. Next time, Rome, working with Barry Levinson on a new script, and a career change. If you're enjoying my episodes, my social media guru, Horatio, has asked that you please like the recordings, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified when I post my next episode on Sunday. Many thanks, and your support is greatly appreciated.